There's a lot of people that talk about Sumerians. There's a lot of self-proclaimed Sumerian experts out there. Most of what they say is not based on any actual research done in Mesopotamia. And so today we'll be going over some of that Sumerian research. And we're going to use this study today, Physical Anthropology and the Sumerian Problem, which is a general review of Sumerian research up to this point. And here we see many people have tried to solve the Sumerian problem with the help of available data, but there is no universally accepted conclusion. First thing we should know is that in that area of Mesopotamia, there were actually many ethnic groups in that area. This wasn't just a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. And we see what it says right here. There is not a single piece of evidence that any migration had occurred in that period, and there's no proof that the Mesopotamian civilization had been created by a population of Iranian origins. Meaning, there's no evidence that the Mesopotamian civilization was created by anybody white. And I'd also like to add, once more, there is no evidence that the Sumerians went to Egypt for the Great White Takeover of Northeast Africa. But we're not here to talk about Egypt. Moving on, the actual material base for the studies on the history of Mesopotamian population is still very poor. Not only that, there are only 3 series of human remains stored in safe places that are large enough for population studies. Therefore, we can say that nothing has been decided when it comes to Sumerians because they hardly have any samples. Following the small number of available data, research papers on the ancient human populations of Mesopotamia are very few. And when they do talk about this stuff, the population history of Mesopotamia is talked about very briefly. And what ends up happening is people develop their own theories, they start making up their own evidence, they start finalizing everything for you, and never tell you that as far as actual research papers on the human populations of Mesopotamia, it's all very lacking. There's only been one official reconstruction of these people using evidence in the past 50 years of research. And that only sampled 56 individuals. It's very important for us to remember that. And I would like to interject here that we need more black scholars to get into this field because the entire thing is completely dominated by Europeans. And as far as pathologies are concerned, there's only been one general review of all previous observations of pathologies, and only a few papers concerning artificial deformations. And they've written a whole lot about Mesopotamian populations, but only a few papers even use data from the cemeteries, which tells you that they've just been going off on tangents without using any evidence. There are no traces of any invasion that have been found in any excavated sites from the Ubaid or the Uruk periods. Once again, the Great White Invasion that they're always describing to you did not happen in the fashion in which they present it to you. So there's no evidence that the Mesopotamian civilization came from the white mountain dwellers in Iran. No evidence at all for that. And the state of Sumerian research today is that the problem has not been solved. Moving on, we can see that the academics ignore in their speculations the archaeological and historical background of the Sumerians, and we are very, very used to that. They will completely ignore whatever evidence is not comfortable for them, and they'll just go ahead and fill that in with what they want it to say. The physical anthropologists have contributed to this nonsense by coming up with theories about Sumerian Indians. They ignore all other evidence, introduce something that's not black, and then just create more fog and mist to get people to come up with more theories. As for the state of Mesopotamian research, the saddest fact is that there are many European countries where more reports on human remains from archaeological sites are written than the total number of all papers from the whole history of excavations in Mesopotamia, which is more geocentric BS. They do the same thing with genetics. The geneticists have devoted their attention almost exclusively to Europeans, and about 80% of people in all genetic tests were European. 80%. And so when we look at the history of Mesopotamian research, there are European countries with more reports on human remains from their archaeology than for the entire history of excavations in Mesopotamia. And so the focus has been entirely on themselves. We got to remember this when the so-called Sumerian expert comes to you with another story. In the 1970s is when we really started seeing things pick up. And by the 80s, they already had their Sumerian theories all drawn up. We see that there was an explosion of studies And by the 70s, they really started going in. By the 80s, it really jumped. And then we had the Gulf War and the militias in the 2000s, and things have sort of slowed down. But the important part for us to remember is that the material base for the Mesopotamian populations is very poor. There's only 3 series of human remains, and most reports on these human remains are very generalized. So don't let anyone come to you and tell you that something has been decided when it comes to Sumerians specifically. The academic empire and the Eurocentrics, they have a little obsession with things that are in the northern parts of these areas. And we see right here that there are many papers concerning the Neolithic population of northern Mesopotamia, because they know that we come from the south. So they got to make sure they focus on the north. And their cutoff point seems to be the late Neolithic for some reason. And we can see right here that they have lots of literature on Neanderthals in northern Mesopotamia. More literature and research on these Neanderthals than actual human beings. So we ask ourselves, why are they so scared to study Mesopotamia? They will study their own archaeological sites more so than Mesopotamia, yet they're the gatekeepers of Mesopotamia. And most importantly, I made sure to put together the total amount of physical remains that have been found. And we see right here that there have been about 1,150 skeletons, bones, or dental collections that they have. The samples that are collected are located in London, Chicago, Osaka, and Warsaw. The London collection is the most important and the most studied, and that collection covers mainly Mesopotamia and eastern Syria. And right now, nobody expects the craniofacial measurements of the bones that they found can reveal the origin of the Sumerians. The most that they can do right now is reconstruct their modes of living and the population characteristics. But again, the material base for such studies is still not well developed. The totality of research is marginal. The facial measurements can do nothing for us right now, and they were highly mixed anyway, most likely. And at the most, they can reconstruct modes of living. But as we're going to see in this series on Mesopotamia, they just want you to keep it moving, so there's no talk of the Negro kingdoms and legends that were there. In today's day and age, they have recognized that this entire thing is exceedingly complex and still far from being sufficiently investigated. So anyone that comes to you as a stylized Sumerian expert, Sumerian anthropologist, they could only have gotten their information from one of these 1,150 skeletons, and we know exactly where they are located. And so if you're a black academic and you want to get into this, you know exactly where to go. When it comes to Sumerian writing, just because someone wrote something in Sumerian type does not mean that person was a Sumerian. Also, another thing we need to remember is that the Sumerians were no longer an identifiable ethnic group after 2000 BC. Again, it was a high level of mixing in that area. This paper says that the discussion about the origins of Sumerians began in 1874. And I just want to say right now that you're going to find out in this series that they were saying a whole lot about Mesopotamia and Negroes at that time. And what I find interesting about this paper is they quote and talk extensively from the old sources, but they mention nothing about the Negro kingdoms that they were talking about back in the 19th century. And these were some very famous names that were talking in this high-powered fashion. I want to go through a little bit of this. I want to go through a little bit of a history of the research right now. The Sumerian problem has been defined explicitly by Henry Frankfurt, who argued that the Sumerians were the first settlers in southern Mesopotamia, except that he says they came from the mountains of Iran in the beginning of the Ubaid period, and that the Semites arrived in the Uruk period and broke the link between the Sumerians and their original homeland. And we're going to see later that they were trying to make the Sumerians after the fact invaders, and they were not able to stick to that. Moving on, Buxton in 1925 noted that the original Mesopotamian population was characterized by dolichocephaly, and that supposedly brachycephaly Sumerians never became a dominating race. Now this word, dolichocephaly, when we go to the encyclopedia to find the definition of this word, we see that such skulls are called dolichocephalic and are typical of Australian Aborigines and native Southern Africans. And it's important for us to remember that. Now, brachycephalic Sumerians, allegedly, is more associated with Mongolians and the Andaman Islanders. So in 1925, Buxton didn't find anybody white over there. The first author who used osteological data and iconography was Stephen Langdon. As early as 1927, he concluded that Kish in the early dynastic period was inhabited by the mixture of Semites and Sumerians, represented by, again, two dolichocephalic races, namely the Euro-Africans and the Mediterraneans. I've said for the past few years on this channel that a so-called black person can also be Mediterranean. So we see by 1927 they are already using their made-up terms and inserting that into the mix. And then later in the period of Persian domination, the third Armenian race also contributed to the local population. This guy also found two different dolichocephalic races that again are typical of Australian Aborigines and native Southern Africans. And so Buxton and Rice argue that a biracial structure of Mesopotamian population had been established in the early dynastic period and that subsequent migrations did not influence it. And when it comes to Mesopotamia, we need to throw all notions of race actually out the window because of the highly mixed nature of that area. We have this guy, Sir Arthur Keith, who went on to develop more Eurocentric theories that do not work today. And he reported on a continuity of Mesopotamian populations since the 4th millennium BC up till now, and then went on to start talking about Iranians and Indians. He then goes on to say that some differences were explained as the effect of an invasion of more so-called black people from the Arabic Peninsula. He then goes on to say that the dolichocephalic people invaded from the Arabic Peninsula. So here we see they were already making the non-white people the invaders. He then goes on to throw in that there's no difference between the Sumerians and the Semites. Again, no such thing as a Semite. That was just another made-up term that they threw in there. In 1971, a Polish author came in, and then he starts claiming that the Sumerians actually came from the area of Tibet and considered that as the place of the Sumerians' place of origin. And then the author of the current paper that we're looking at throws in Central Asia, which brings them into the magic Caucasian orbit. So when these civilizations were originally discovered, they talked very much about Negro kingdoms. Then they start talking about Iranians, Indians, Euro-Africans, now it's Tibet, maybe Central Asia. Then they go on to say that the previous research for Sumerian race was actually pointless. They were saying that they thought they came from a distant place and in a small number sufficient to subordinate the local population, but not to change its racial characteristic, which sounds exactly like European colonialism. Research back in those days was a lot of it was tinged with colonial fantasies. In the 30s, there was a German scholar by the name of Spicer. He says the ancient cities of Sumer were Elamite in origin, and the Elamites, to him, were the people from the mountains and the Kassites who inhabited Mesopotamia. Now we're going to go ahead and dwell on this for a minute because I'm familiar with the research, and what he did was make the people who were being dominated the Sumerians. Now we see right here at the bottom of the screen, when we go back in time to their old research, this research that you see on the bottom of your screen was not included in this paper, and you can see why. Now let's look at what was written here by Spicer in 1936, saying that the Sumerians were Elamites and that they came from the mountains. The Elamites did not come from the mountains, first of all. Dieulafoy, he wrote a lot about the Susa, and we see right here that he quotes from Hussey, who says that the Susian Negritos were in contact with the Mediterranean peoples from the most distant antiquity. In the early days of their researching these areas, they most definitely said that the Susans were so-called Negroes. Now, as for the Elamites coming from the mountains, Dieulafoy writes right here that the whites poured into the plains of the Tigris and remained master of the country until they were subdued, and then added to the territory of the blacks were numerous districts that were all mountainous districts once inhabited by the whites of the Scythian race, who were the barbarians living further north. Now you see that in 1893, the people living in those mountains were white. So when we fast forward to 1936, and now all of a sudden the mountain people are the Sumerians. We go on here, Dieulafoy writes about Memnon, and writes about one of the Greek legends where Memnon commanded an army of black and white soldiers and Ethiopians. And one of the versions of Memnon's origin story was that he had a white mountain mother. Again, there goes those mountains again being associated with white people. And so when we fast forward to the 1930s, I guess they didn't like that. So this guy Spicer wants to tell you that the ancient cities of Sumer were Elamite in origin, that the Elamites were living in the mountains. And we are going to see that those people living in those mountains were most definitely the white barbarians who pushed up on our civilizations near the Tigris River. As we move on, the Sumerians were thought to invade Mesopotamia from the south. There goes the south again, coming through the Persian Gulf from the east. Spicer suggested they may have even been related to Indians. So therefore, they got to make sure that people are Dravidians and not black when coming through the Persian Gulf. And also notice now how the Sumerians are now the invaders. They were trying to make the Sumerians into invaders. So it's the same type of language, but now they just change it to Dravidian. And they love to deploy invasion imagery because they themselves are invaders. Spicer then goes on to argue that the diversity of cultural tradition in late Neolithic Mesopotamia was a reflection of ethnic differences. And again, there was not any sort of one type of people there. He says the different cultures were developed by different ethnic groups. But then he goes on to say that the Sumerians came after the fact and had initially settled only in the head of the Persian Gulf. And that the Uruk period, they moved northward and eventually lost their racial distinctiveness. Now, what he was doing here was important because this was the beginnings of taking away the Negro kingdoms of Mesopotamia and turning them into a mishmash of nothing. Spicer's theories were further developed by Jan Braun, who then put together similarities between Sumerian and Tibetan languages. And that's when they really started going buck wild, saying that the Sumerians came to Mesopotamia on ships from northern India. And so they go from Tibet to somehow leaving from northern India. And in spite of their small number, dominated the local population due to their much more sophisticated culture. And it was only later that the Semitic tribes prevailed. And this was supported by another Eurocentric. And what we see right here is that they use language to conjure up ships with no evidence, by the way, which, as far as I'm concerned, is another Christopher Columbus fantasy. They use European colonial imagery as the end result. They dominate the local population. Like they say here, that in spite of their small number, they dominated the local population. Now, just to remind you that there was no evidence for any of this. And then what they do is they tell you that they brought high culture from their castle in the sky. Just like how England, France, and Spain like to tell you. And then they get their buddies to co-sign. They get published in a journal ran and funded by their friends. And then they celebrate this theft as we stand by and watch. And, most, so-called black people don't care anyway as they do this. And so they complete their theft by adding their own linguistic inventions. And the way they did that was this guy, Bino, named some important Sumerian cities and claims that certain terms in Sumerian were borrowed from another language or languages, and that the original inhabitants had somehow forgotten all of these languages before the invention of writing. Again, he provides no evidence. He then creates his own language. It's called Proto-Euphratean and Proto-Tigridian. And this theory has been influential since the 1970s when they had that explosion of research. And all of that was dominated by Spicer's speculation, and it was compatible altogether. So we see that they complete their theft by adding their own linguistic inventions. They claim that the original inhabitants had somehow forgot something, but they present no evidence as to how they forgot it. They then marry this to their colonial fantasy, so they have a more complete story. And then comes the Anunnaki stories, the cartoon theories, and more distractions from the Negroes that they were talking about before. So slowly their fantasy story starts coming together. And you got to remember that the academic empire, what they do that we don't do is they work together. And they work together to bring their little theories together. So we see right here that Leo Oppenheim argues that the Sumerians possibly belong to a group of languages specific for the mountaineers. Again, let me tell you guys something right now. They knew that it was some sort of white people living up in them mountains and in those caves and in those mountains. They knew that. And they had to find a way to make sure that the Sumerians came from the mountains. And they've done a very poor job with that. So we see right here that this guy tried to write in 1977 that the mountains in the east may have been a cradle of Sumerians. But when we go and look at the research that was not included in this study, you see again that they said the mountainous districts were inhabited by whites of the Scythian race, and that their lands were added to the territory of the blacks. This was long after the Sumerians had already showed up. Again, one of Memnon's legends was that he had a white mother from the mountains. And we see again that Memnon, one of his legends was that he had a white mother from the mountains of Susa. And this is all a part of their plan to make the white invader the official Sumerian and only inhabitants of the land. Now down here at the bottom of the screen, I made sure to include these quotes from Encyclopedia Britannica, who knows all about all of this. So what they do is they start talking about the Kassites. And I noticed right away that they wrote right here that the Kassites, they believed, perhaps wrongly, to have originated in the Zagros Mountains of Iran. And really though, they couldn't have possibly have come from anywhere else. Now, what's important is right here. In the first millennium, the Kassites withdrew to the Zagros Mountains. Again, they had nowhere else to go. They opposed the eastward expansion of Assyrian power, paid tribute to Persia from those mountains. We had taken back most of Mesopotamia east of the Tigris River and reached all the way to Persepolis. And so we see again, Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that these people were pushed to the east, pushed to the mountains, but Encyclopedia Britannica puts in parentheses that people believe, perhaps wrongly, that these people had originated from the Zagros Mountains when they know damn well that these were some white mountain dwellers. And so by the 1970s, they wanted to tell you that the Sumerians were actually the white mountain dwellers that were living in the east. And in this day and age, that has been rejected. And so they had to to continue all this nonsense, you got to add some linguistics into it. So the linguistic arguments started coming in, being added to the mix. And we see that Gelb stressed the link between ethnic and linguistic identity and recognized the previous racial arguments as inadequate. Although Gelb was inconsistent with this. So make sure that your linguistic inventions are tied to something ethnic, meaning white, and then announce that the previous information was inadequate, and then replace it with something else inadequate. And as usual, we get a lack of consistency, which does become a regular feature, and the academic empire is never punished for their inconsistency. And then we had this guy, Kramer, 1948. Once again, more invasions of barbarians to a more civilized country. And then he starts talking about Greeks, Germans, and Aryan traditions. And so he speculates that the Sumerians must have been barbarians who invaded Mesopotamia. So again, he wants to take the white barbarians and just completely replace the Sumerians with them. And they had known for years that the barbarians lived in those mountains. And so what we got to understand is that they were trying very hard to make sure that the barbarians were invaders who came in and became Sumerians when they have no evidence for that. So in his reconstruction, this is his story. Mesopotamia was first settled by immigrants, once again from Iran, and then later they mixed with the fake Semites who mysteriously came from the west, and then both of them together created the Mesopotamian civilization, who then came into contact with early Sumerians, who were nomadic tribes from the Caucasian mountains. And that these Sumerians were then defeated by the Mesopotamians and blah, 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 blah. There was never any evidence for that at all. Matter of fact, this whole idea about Semites inhabiting Mesopotamia before the Sumerians, that idea was invented by a dude named Edward in the first decade of the 20th century. So throughout the 20th century, they wanted to associate as many European-type things as they could with the Sumerians, and they continued to fail miserably with this. Here, Kramer maintained that the Sumerians came from the area of the Caucasian Sea and pointed to some city in Iran, and then a so-called affinity with some European languages, which did not get demonstrated. But we see none of that was grounded in any actual archaeological evidence. And then we see that was not grounded in any actual archaeological evidence. They just ignore that. And Joan Oates noted a cultural continuity from the beginning of the Ubaid period. And that's because there never was any evidence of any sort of invasion or takeover of Mesopotamia at these most important times, just like Egypt. And so Kramer created his own evidence. Nothing that he stated was grounded in reality or evidence of any kind. But his job was to develop the master plan, and he did a very poor job, and he was also heavy-handed when he did it. The fact of the matter is, there is no evidence that Mesopotamian civilization came from the white mountain dwellers in Iran. There are no traces of any invasion that have been found in any excavated site. And at this period that everyone's talking about, the late Neolithic, early Copper Age, the population, there's no single piece of evidence that any migration had occurred in that time. And there's no proof as of today that the Mesopotamian civilization had been created by a population of Iranian origins. There's just not. Skepticism about that has prevailed, and this problem has been recognized as insoluble. And that's the state of the current research today. And so we see they came up with all kinds of European theories that they were not able to hold on to. We see that this entire thing is exceedingly complex and still far from being sufficiently investigated. We see that they ignore all of their evidence and just come up with their own theories. They introduce things that are so-called not black into the anthropology. They create fog. And when it comes to investigating the human remains from these archaeological sites, they make sure that they take their sweet time doing that, even though they're sitting on over 1,000 specimens that they can take a look at. But they study their own archaeological sites more so than the entire history of Mesopotamia. And that all goes hand in hand with them studying their own DNA and using that to determine everything for everyone else in this world. And after going over this little history of the research, you can see that a lot of their ideas picked up in the 70s. And they started developing this stuff in the 30s, 40s, 50s. But previously, before that, they talked in a completely different way. You guys are going to see that when we get to the Mesopotamians and the Persians in the next video. In conclusion, we got to remember that they only have about 1,000 skeletons, bones, or dental collections. We got the 4 cities where those are located. The state of that research is very poor. The research papers are not enough. The problem has only been treated very briefly. And then when anyone comes to me talking about something's been debunked, you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Don't even talk to me. There's only been one official reconstruction in 50 years of research. 50 years, that tells us that they don't want to research. You know why? Because their daddies back in the day were talking about the Negro kingdoms of Persia, the Negro kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon, and all of that. Only one review of pathologies. The point that I'm making here is there is not enough information. Today's video is more of a focus on the Sumerians rather than Mesopotamia as a whole, but we're going to get into Mesopotamia on the next video. We're going to be talking about Susiana, we're going to be talking about Elam and our Negro kingdoms, white mountain dwellers that came in and invaded, pushed them deep into those mountains where they came from. Join me for that, and I'll see you guys next time.